You're listening to episode 77 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Patricia Lynn Dobkin joins us to speak about her new book, Mindful Medical Practitioners, a guide for clinicians and educators. Teaching mindfulness can be a very challenging activity. Introducing it to various contexts requires a deep understanding of those environments, the attitudes and perspectives of the potential participants, and an elegant navigation of the cultural context in which the practice is being introduced. The nuances of the medical profession are perhaps some of the most complex with which a teacher needs to relate, integrate, and thrive. Our guest today is Patricia Lynn Dobkin. Patricia, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Very glad to have you here. In particular, the two different related books that you've put together, but I want to start by having you tell us about your background.
Okay, well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am tenured in the Department of Medicine at McGill University. And I have been practicing meditation and mindfulness most of my adult life. When I was 19, I followed the hippie trail to India, and I lived in a place called Oroville, where I began to understand that work can be a spiritual practice. But it took a long time to make the full circle so that when I worked in a very conservative medical environment, I could actually bring something like mindfulness into the curriculum and into the mainstream of medicine. So it's really been a long journey, but now I've been able to do this, and the two books that I'm going to talk about today in some ways reflect that journey.
So your first book, Mindful Medical Practice, Clinical Narratives and Therapeutic Insights. Tell us about that. What prompted you to get that published?
Well, I actually had the inspiration while I was meditating at a lakeside in the country where loons were wailing. And loons in Canada are very symbolic of the essence of the wild. And their voices moved me. And I had this idea that I had heard many voices of clinicians, physicians, other psychologists or social workers who very much like loons kind of sang a song. And I thought that we could share their stories about how mindfulness is actually applied in clinical practice. So I invited 25 different people from all over the world. There's 5 countries represented. And the simple question I asked them was, can you write a story, a narrative, a true story about how mindfulness has been applied to your clinical practice? So one of the things I wanted to do was celebrate these heroes who are actually very kind and generous and giving with their patients in a context of medicine that's been very harsh. And I know in the States, the issues you have with medicine are a little different than ours in Canada, but they all feel the pressure, and burnout rates are very high. And there's been a lot of negative attention towards their work. And I wanted to show how they are actually working in different departments. So I have a surgeon, I have family medicine people, palliative care, pediatricians, an emergency doctor. And what I said was show us, the readers, how you integrate mindfulness in your work. So, for example, I would highlight being curious or being non-judging or being loving and kind and have their stories kind of depict that.
And the recent book, Mindful Medical Practitioners, A Guide for Clinicians and Educators, how is that one different than the first book?
It's completely different. So the first one has 28 chapters, 3 of which I wrote, and they're all except for the intro and the actual stories. The second one, it answered questions that I continually got, and I should highlight the fact that I co-wrote this with Dr. Hefford, and he is a general practitioner in Australia, and he is the founder of a program in medical school in Monash, where they've been integrating mindfulness in the education of medical students for almost 20 years. So he was really at the forefront. So I wanted to co-author with him because he's a medical doctor, whereas I'm a clinical psychologist. And our chapters reflect what is currently known. So first, we have a chapter on, well, why would people practice medicine mindfully? And then who would practice it? And then how do you actually get this into a curriculum? So very practical steps. But we also wanted to show the evidence. So our second chapter, for example, is all the scientific evidence that we could kind of summarize in a chapter as to, for example, how mindfulness contributes to the well-being of clinicians and either prevents or treats burnout, how it contributes to the quality of care. And so we knew that to engage people in mainstream medicine, we needed to speak the language of medicine, and that was evidence-based. So the first book is very lyrical. The stories are very touching. I mean, some of the writing completely moves the reader by the emotional tone of it. So the second book is more academic, if you will. It's a little bit drier. It is meant to appeal to those who might be skeptical or might think, oh, it's not possible to do this in my environment or my institution. So we talk about how you approach those who create or approve or disapprove curriculum. And then I have a chapter that's very close to my heart, chapter 7, on training the educators or the teachers or really it's called educating teachers. And that's an important distinction because much like in teaching people mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's not something you learn by rote. It's first practice yourself internally before you can possibly think of pointing the way to others. So since mindfulness has become so popular, I thought it was essential to write with clarity about the integrity of teachers, about the necessity of their own path, not just training, like go to a workshop and learn how to do something and come back and teach it. More of how long does it take to really come to the point where you feel ready to guide others in this way of being. And so that chapter I think is important. And in the last chapter, we talked about how the culture needs to be changed for this to be integrated in mainstream practice. Because we can train our medical students, our residents, and our attendings how to be mindful. But if they're in a culture that doesn't allow them to practice that way, then they won't. They can't. And so the last chapter kind of reflected on the culture of medicine and how it needs to be changed. And then we gave 2 examples of where it has been changed to show this is possible. And then the final section was on what we call mid-mindfulness. So we must be very careful not to try and go too fast and throw these programs together without really reflecting on how they can be integrated in the kind of work we do. So it's not just for MDs. It's also for the social worker program wants to integrate some mindfulness training or clinical psychology, which of course I know in the States they do much of this, or nurses. nurses have been underserved in this way, and they're often at the edge and really taking the brunt of all the work in medicine. So we didn't want to restrict it only to medicine, even though I call it mindful medical practice. And I do that in part because I work in the Department of Medicine, and I've been trying for 15 years to get this accepted and appreciated in an arena that wasn't very open to it in the beginning.
It's interesting hearing the perspective of what we run into quite often in, I think, medical institutions, that this is viewed as a training. That if I take this training, I can then go teach it. And you brought up a very important point that there's a foundational element of having one's own practice to really have this sink in and integrate as part of your life before taking that next step. I'm wondering if you run into that fairly frequently, that initially the awareness of this or the thought about it, the approach is, oh, this is a training I take, like learning how to suture, and then I can go off and do it on my own. Is that what you've been running into?
Absolutely. I still teach MBSR, and in fact, this afternoon I'll be teaching class 2. And I have a lot of healthcare professionals who take my courses. That's what I'm best known for. And when I ask their intention about taking the course, be it mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindful medical practice, because I have 2, very often I see on the list, I want to teach this. And when I interview them beforehand, I gently let them know that this is the first step, and it's a good first step, but it's a long journey, and that one engages in the practice first before teaching. And so I have a way of letting people know that it's not just something you turn around and do after even a 7-day retreat or workshop. So that's very important, because whenever I hear people talk about meditation like it's a technique, I always say, no, it's not a technique. It's a way of, meditation fosters a way of being. And so what we're trying to teach certainly in our medical school is, how are you as a human being when you are treating this other human being? And at McGill Programs in Whole Person Care, where I work, we are invested in teaching how to promote healing. But we say you can't promote healing in others until you've had that experience yourself, or that you're able to reflect and go through whatever you need to be in a place where you can do that. And so even in our teaching about healing, it's the same. It's heal thyself. Dr. Santarelli's book said it clearly, and he was right. And we need to do this because, in fact, when we can acknowledge that we are wounded healers, then we can be at the same level with other human beings. I'll never forget when I was trained by Florence at University of Massachusetts Medical School. And I said to her, Florence, I'm a psychologist, and the only one among all these doctors is MD. And she said something I'll never forget. She said, Patricia, in mindfulness, there's no hierarchy. And I never forgot that. But it also works in the sense of, for physicians, and especially in medicine, it's very hierarchical. I try and help them see that there's no hierarchy either. And when I teach physicians in particular, and if there's patients in the room, I might say to them something to the effect of, if you live long enough, you also will be a patient. And if you don't live long enough, then you will surely be a patient. So I try and get at Neff's idea of common humanity. And that's what we're doing in this kind of practice, this clinical practice that brings mindfulness in the forefront. How, as human beings, can we take care of each other? It's very relational. And the first book really shows that. The stories are all about relationships. They are about people taking care of each other and learning from each other. And very often that's bi-directional. You take one of the stories called Carmen's Story by Dr. Kearsley, who's a radiation oncologist. And we had in the room with him 2 medical students, the patient and himself. And what he did was really creative. he had them each write their perspective of what happened in that clinical encounter. It was amazing and it was beautiful. It was very moving. And so he's a doctor in his early 70s, and he's an MD, PhD with all the credentials and all the research background. And he shows such an open heart and such a sense of common humanity that it's totally moving. But also, he shows us the other perspective.
Something else you referred to, and I think this is related to that, is the idea of the cultural shift that needs to occur. I know in my own experience, going through some medical issues, dealing with doctors who were maybe didn't have the best bedside manner, shall we say, and had an attitude that made it very difficult for me as a patient to be involved in the process of my own treatments. So I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the unique needs of teaching in the medical setting. What is that culture shift? How do we address those issues?
Well, that's why I have a second course called Mindful Medical Practice. And in that course, what I do is, first of all, it's usually mostly MDs. And I have exercises that are in line with the MBSR in terms of, let's say, communication, mindful communication. But I use exercises that really emphasize the interaction between the patients and doctors. So, and I also integrate Gregory Kramer's insight dialogue. So I use insight dialogue, and if your listeners don't know what that is, it's a way of meditating, if you want, under workout. So you're in the same kind of mindset or states, but you do it when you interact verbally with another person. So I've included in the variation of the theme of MBSR a lot more emphasis on clinical encounters and how to bring awareness to that encounter. And I think in the first book, yes, it's the first book in my first chapter, I have a figure that shows how this interaction occurs between the clinician, the patient, and the disease. And so I very overtly teach that to those who take my course. And at this point, I've taught certainly over 300 doctors. So I believe in the ripple effect. And so these doctors, in fact, the reason I switched from teaching MBSR to patients, because my clinical background is in chronic pain and chronic illness, is I realized that, let's say I had 20 patients here in a class, excuse me, and another 20 there, I could never, ever reach all the people that need to learn how to live with their illness, let's say. And then I realized doctors, they see thousands of patients. And so if I put my energy towards training them to be more mindful with their patients, just imagine the ripple effect.
So what recommendations do you have for those who want to teach, particularly in that setting?
I recommend that it's not to promote my book. The reason I wrote the book with Dr. Hatchett is I recommend they read it because we used to get these emails of, how do I set up a program? I want to start an elective, in Vanderbilt University or here or there. And I always thought, well, I can't answer that in an email or even in an interview like this because there's so many steps and considerations to keep in mind. So the second book is really practical. The chapter not only gives the evidence like the second chapter, but, for example, we have a chapter, I'm just going to the table of contents here now. The third chapter is applied mindfulness in medicine. So it talks about communication skills, developing empathy, compassion, critical reasoning. And so it's very concrete, if you will. And then we highlight 3 medical schools in the world where it has been integrated in the medical curriculum and how that got done, the story behind it, how do you approach the powers that be, how do you get them to accept it in the curriculum. And then we have in chapter 5 steps for starting and sustaining the program. So it's really contextualizing, being clear on your intentions, being faithful to the philosophy, but flexible with the form. And so in many ways, that book answers your question. And so I think that's why the book needed to be written, because it's a complex question. And you can't give a simple answer because you have to think about all those things. And that's what we did. We wrote this book in 9 weeks, put all our energy into it. And the exchange between us was really enriching because he had done it in Australia. We had done it in Canada, in Rochester with Epstein and Krasner, leaders in mindful practice. We came together and we really put our minds and hearts into that book so that others could see the path, but they would have to be flexible. They'd have to see in their institution what works, what are the needs, what is possible.
Patricia, was there anything else you wanted to share with the listeners?
I think I would just like to read 2 passages from the first book that are quite short. But what I did is I looked in the last chapter at how the characteristics of a mindful person actually get translated into a clinical encounter. So if you could indulge me, I'll just read maybe 2 or 3 because they say it all. And for example, take the quality of non-judgment. So we know that non-judgment is where we accept things as they are without labeling them as good or bad, but just present. So this passage comes from a chapter called I Am My Brother's Keeper. And it's Dr. Dennis Dobkin, who's a cardiologist in the United States. So here's what he said, and I'm just taking a snippet. He said, recently, I saw Morris W. again after a several-year hiatus. He had just gotten out of jail and was in mild heart failure, quite hypertensive, and not taking any medication. He was with his brother, who seemed to care about him. He physically looked the same, but my view was quite different now. Being more mindful, I listened to his travails about jail, his struggles with alcohol, and how he was searching for a path to get better. I applied my meditation skills to the clinic setting. I shared his disappointment in himself. I felt compassion for this young man whose life was not going well. I couldn't tell if he had changed or if I had changed, but it didn't seem to matter. I felt more involved and somehow more hopeful. I was able to exchange places with him and subsequently viewed him differently. So that's an example of non-judgment. And here's an example of beginner's mind. So being able to see the richness of the present moment and cultivate a mind as if everything was brand new. And this is Dr. Kearsley that I mentioned earlier, the radiation oncologist from Australia. This is very simple. This is to show us beginner's mind. I felt a sense of anticipation, almost excitement at the prospect of meeting a totally unknown person and the prospect of making a difference in whatever opportunities presented themselves. I enjoy the not knowing about who the next person might be. And then a final little excerpt. And this is from Dr. Coles, who's an emergency room physician in the States. And this is about generosity, giving within a context of love and compassion without attachment to gain or thought of return. So Dr. Cole says, the emergency room physician is witness to countless intimate moments of pain, fear, stress, and vulnerability. We see the dark side of life, the subcultures of abuse and neglect, the realities of poverty and loneliness, the consequences of ignoring the body and the spirit's true needs. We also bear witness to moments of inexplicable beauty, compassion, and tenderness. The best kept secret in the field of medicine is this. Healers want the very best life for their patients, even if they can't always cure or save them. They serve with a dedication that threatens to devour them. So those are examples of these compassionate doctors. And I am sure there are thousands of them. And they are the kind of physicians that exemplify what compassion is and why people go into medicine in the first place. And medicine tends to beat it out of them. And what we're trying to do is help them come back to their original intention. When you meet first-year medical students, they are full of enthusiasm and willingness to give themselves completely, and they want to help their fellow human beings. And we have to be very careful that that stays alive. And so our work at McGill is really aimed towards keeping that alive so that when you as patient or me or anyone else encounters a doctor, hopefully they'll be able to be self-aware enough that they can, interact with you in such a way that promotes your own healing. So that's really what we're trying to do.
Those were wonderful passages. Thank you for reading those. For those who are listening, if you want to find out more, I am linking to Patricia's page on the McGill site, as well as linking to both of the books that we've talked about today. Patricia, thank you so much for being here.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.